Well, good evening, everybody, or good day, whatever time you're watching this. Welcome to Talking Everything Bible, and welcome to chapter 4 of the book of 1 Samuel. Before we get started tonight, I want to give a little historical perspective, because one of the quick questions that was asked last week was, what is the ark doing in Shiloh? And so I thought I'd look that up and try to find out why was the ark in Shiloh. Well, so historically, it turns out that this time, Israel was pretty chaotic as far as a country, because if you go back to Judges, they've been at war with the Philistines and other neighbors for quite some time. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel by name only at this time. It's not really physically the capital of Israel. And remember that doesn't get established really as the capital until David. Okay. And the temple isn't built until Solomon. So there is no temple in Jerusalem. That's one of the reasons the ark is not there. So we're still at a time where the tabernacle was a mobile site, except that somewhere in the war with the Philistines, they decided to set up a temple in Shiloh. And it wasn't a Jewish temple. They just used some buildings that were there and turned it into a temple, and basically just hid the ark there, because the Philistines have always been after the ark, and so they were hiding the ark in Shiloh, and we're going to find out a lot about that tonight, because our attention is going to turn from Samuel to the Ark of the Covenant for a while, so it'll be kind of interesting. Okay, but before we get started on chapter 4, I've asked Peggy to give us our little recap, and so Peggy, would you recap chapter 3, please?
Okay. So in general, in 2 Samuel chapter 3, we learn about Samuel's time as a boy in the house of the Lord and how he became a prophet as Eli leaves in shame. But first of all, Samuel was literally being raised both physically and spiritually by Eli. What was amazing is that in these days, the word of the Lord was rare. This calls into question what Eli was really teaching the young boy about the Lord. He may have taught him temple administration, but not so much about the one who was in the temple. It's during this time that Samuel has his first encounter with the Lord. He was called 3 times, and 3 times mistakenly, he thought it was Eli. After the 3rd time, Eli realized it was the Lord calling Samuel. So he sent him back and said, if he calls you again, tell him, Lord, I'm listening. It seems that Eli himself wasn't in tune with the presence of the Lord. Nevertheless, he had Samuel go back. And when the Lord called him for the 4th time, this time the Lord told Samuel that the promise he had made to Eli about his family long ago was about to become true. At this point, Samuel, the next day, Samuel gets pressured by Eli, who wants to know what the Lord told him. Interestingly, Eli, after Samuel tells him, well, the Lord is going to come through on his promise to have you and your family pay for the sins of your past, and you can never restore that. There'll be no atonement for that. Eli comes up, though, with a strange response, which is that the Lord is the Lord, and he can do what is good in his life. We learned that the Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he was a prophet. God continued to reveal himself through his word to Samuel, and that's where we left off.
Thank you very much, Peggy. All right, now we pick up chapter 4. Now, chapter 4, we move away from Samuel. We move away from that. It kind of switches scenes, so to speak. And chapter 4 underscores another key theme of the book of Samuel, namely the importance of waiting for the word of the Lord and the danger of failing to do so. After the initial defeat by the Philistines, the elders are sufficiently astute theologically to wonder aloud why the Lord has brought defeat, but they do not, in fact, inquire of the Lord and wait for an answer. They immediately go about planning their own rescue, thinking to manipulate the ark almost as a tool in their own hands. So the ark now becomes our center character, so to speak, the Ark of the Covenant, which was hidden in Shiloh. And the war now turns, and it's kind of interesting because the Bible doesn't, or the book of Samuel doesn't give us a lot of detail about the war between the Philistines and Israel. All it says is that, they're defeated and the ark is taken. So let's pick it up with Linda. Would you read verses 1 through 3, please?
Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies."
We have to understand how battles worked back then, okay? They didn't actually invade each other's countries. The battles were fought usually on a neutral ground somewhere. They would Israelites set up camp on one side, Philistines on the other. They'd fight the battle. Then whoever wins gets to, have their way with the other group, or there's a consequence, or they just go back and start over again, which is the case here. So the Israelites get defeated, and they go back to their side, to their camp. And oh, by the way, this is also practical because they didn't have flashlights, and so the battles were fought in the day, and then at night everybody went back because they couldn't really fight at night. So it was a practical aspect to that. But now the Israelites' thinking starts to really go a little wacko. Israel's initial defeat by the Philistines is described quickly. Responsibly for starting the conflict is not assigned, but for several reasons it seems likely that the Philistines were the aggressors. They are regularly referred to as the uncircumcised in the Bible and are held in contempt. Not for lacking culture, their material culture was in many ways richer than the Israel's in this period, but for their inexhaustible opposition to the people and purposes of God. The Philistines represented the quintessential foreign adversary. The magnitude of Israel's first defeat in the passage was about 4,000. Now, it's interesting, in Hebrew, it actually says, it doesn't give that number of 4,000. And in the literal Hebrew translation, it says 4 military units, which was later translated to 4,000. Regardless of whether the defeat cost Israel 4,000 soldiers or 4 military units, comprising perhaps as few as 40 soldiers, The mere fact of a loss was sufficient to cause consternation among Israel's elders. Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? The Israelites ask themselves. The theological understanding underlying this question is appropriate. The elders do not pursue an answer to their question. There's no mention of prayer, for instance, but proceed immediately to propose a plan of their own. Let's bring the Ark of the Lord of the Covenant from Shiloh. So you have to understand their thinking here. They don't respect God. They don't listen to God, but they want to use his power to defeat the Philistines. Do you get this here? Okay, they want to use the Ark of the Covenant as a weapon against the Philistines. What do you think the Ark of the Covenant represents?
Well, it's evident that the ark represented the presence of God, because it says, so that he may go with us, suggesting that he wasn't with them.
Yolanda?
Yeah, I think it reads as though they really thought of the ark as, yes, the presence of God, but almost like an idol, because the presence of God had not, in fact, really been with them in force. And so to me, it seems like they're treating the ark as an idol almost.
It's almost as though it was an afterthought. We didn't win this and we got defeated. Oh my. Oh yeah. We have the ark. So I agree that it just became an object at that point.
Yeah, object. It's almost like they treat it like a talisman, if you will. It's a talisman, and also it reminds me of the seven sons of Siva who tried to cast the demon out of a person, and then the demon says, "I know Jesus, I know Paul, but who the heck are you?" So it kind of said, so let's say the Ark of the Covenant was the presence of God, but the people there did not have who doesn't know God nor relationship with him. So let's say God was there. What does he care? Well, I get it, but you kind of get what I'm saying here. Whether or not God was there, they don't know him.
We're going to find out the power of the ark, but at this particular point, there doesn't seem to be any power in the ark. And we're going to find that out here shortly. But the ark is just that. It's a wooden box. Okay, it represents God's presence. And when God decides to be present, people will know it. But here's the thing also, I love the way it says, they asked God, why did they get defeated? But they never waited for an answer, or even seemed like the implication they didn't even want an answer. There was no real understanding of anything except, let's see, maybe because we didn't bring our secret weapon. Let's bring our secret weapon. Okay. Yolanda?
Yeah, I don't, as I read it, maybe it's this translation, but to me, there's not really any indication that they were asking God. In this translation, at least, it just suggests that they, almost as if they were asking themselves, why did the Lord, as opposed to asking God, why did you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was the thing. They weren't asking God. They were asking, why did God? And it just went to their theological not understanding anything at this point. Okay, let's go on to verses 4 through 11. Ezra, would you read that?
So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord Almighty. who is enthroned between the cherubims, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord has come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has ever happened before. Happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plague in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died.
Okay, a lot here to cover, but couple of interesting things. One thing, there's quite a bit of insight about the Philistines here. You know, we think of the Philistines of the story of David and Goliath, and we think of them as these dumb people who big giants. They were anything but that. The Philistines were very cultured, especially in things like art and things like that. They were a cultured society. They weren't these dumb brutes as a lot of stories make out. And notice how knowledgeable the Philistines are. They know the stories of the what happened in Egypt, which is now quite a long time ago, several generations ago. But they know the stories of what happened in Egypt. They know the history of Israel.
They knew enough to take the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah. And it surprises me a little bit that they were able to take the Ark of the Covenant. But I think it was all part of God's plan. But the ark was nothing to be trifled with. I mean, it had to be carried a certain way, it had to be handled a certain way, it had to be, and for the Philistine to take it, that's quite a feat. And but we're going to find out more about that in the next couple of chapters. So, all right, the people wasted no time in bringing from Shiloh the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord God Almighty, then this is interesting, who is enthroned between the ark, carried powerful associations. Back the ark of the covenant of the Lord God Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubims. That's an interesting statement, Now, that was basically a way of saying what we've already said, which it represented his presence, but the wording is interesting. Okay. The cherubims were, of course, the protectors of the ark, the thing. And so as a much later period, Hebrews 9:4 states that the ark contained the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. While the content of the ark is not listed so succinctly in the Old Testament, the writer of Hebrew likely drew on texts indicating that at some point all three items were deposited in the ark. In other words, it wasn't certain whether those were always together in the ark, or that the Old Testament never mentions these items together in the ark. It's only till the New Testament writer of Hebrews, which is supposedly Paul puts the three together. Where he gets that, we don't really know. Lest the reader be tempted to join all Israel in their unrestrained enthusiasm as the as the ark of the Lord is brought into the camp in verse 5, the narrator notes at the end of verse 4 that the ark is attended by Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. This brief notice is ominous, given that the foregoing narrative have described of the shameful behavior of these two and the judgment certain to befall them. The great shout in the Israelite camp not only shook the ground, but alerted the nearby Philistines that something momentous must have occurred in the Hebrew camp. Whatever their initial plans, whether to wield the ark as a kind of cultic power object, or as it seems more likely, to force the Lord's hand by bringing the symbol of his presence into the field of battle, it failed dramatically. While the ark's capture might seem to constitute a theological crisis, the collateral notice regarding Hophni and Phinehas may hint at the fact that the Lord has not lost control of the situation. After all, that they should die together on the same day is precisely in fulfillment of the sign announced by the man of God in chapter 2. Yeah, interesting here. Of course, the battle is not only lost, but it is fulfillment of prophecy, in that the two sons are killed together on the same day. Now, interestingly enough, had the ark not been brought, the sons would have not come. And so again, you can kind of see this is all kind of coming together here. And this was partly, God fulfilling what he had said was going to happen, and the consequences of where Israel was spiritually at this time. Okay, let's finish with 12 to 18. I'm sorry, we got two sections. 12 through 18. Jimmy, would you read that for us?
That same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh, his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching because his heart feared for the ark of God. When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of this uproar?" The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old and whose eyes were set so that he could not see. He told Eli, "I have just come from the battle line. I led from it this very day." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had led Israel 40 years.
Okay. A lot more insight here. Well, Eli dies dramatically. The shocking news of Israel's catastrophic defeat is brought speedily to Shiloh, where Eli is stationed at his usual place, watching at the gate because his heart feared for the ark of God. While Eli was watching might be simply a case of cited language in reference to a blind man, several considerations suggest otherwise. As noted earlier, the narrator regularly refers to Eli's dim-sightedness, seemed to intend to connote not just a physical malady, but a spiritual dim-sightedness as well. The explicit focus on Eli's fear, not for Israel, nor even for his own sons, but for the ark of God, suggests a refocusing of his affections and allegiance despite all the bad news of the day, including the death of his two sons. It was only when the Benjamite messenger mentioned the ark of God that Eli fell backwards off his chair by the side of his gate. Taken together, these features paint a picture of an old priest who has been slumbering but is beginning to wake up. Eli is beginning to regain his balance, to find again his center of gravity. Sadly, whatever encouraged the text may contain regarding Eli's spiritual rehabilitation, the dire news of the day caused him to lose his physical balance and fall. Now an old man and heavy, Eli dies under his own weight. It is interesting. I think I go back to something Ezra said last week about, are we being too hard on Eli? Here, Eli, the writer kind of saying, the description of Eli here by the writer of this text, which we don't really know who it is, but by the writer of this text is saying that, this is Eli's priorities have shifted. This is quite a bit of time later from chapter 4 jumps quite a bit in time, by the way, from chapter 3. We do kind of need to know that. And Eli is he is old. He's an old man, but he's beginning. His priorities have shifted. Notice that he's most concerned about the ark more than he is about his son. I don't think Eli had much affection for his sons at this point anymore. And he might have been kind of relieved to hear that, okay, those scoundrels are gone. Good riddance, But when the ark is captured, that basically kills him. That news basically kills him. But of course, it's prophesied that he dies soon after his sons die. So again, this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Okay. We got to just move on. We'll do some closing comments, but we need to go ahead and move on to 19 through 22. And Peggy, would you take that?
His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the women attending her said, "Don't despair, you have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband." She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured."
Kind of on the same line as Eli. Here, this woman is going through all this, losing, dying during the birth of her son, on her dying bed, just having lost her husband and her father-in-law. What's she most concerned about? The loss of the ark from Israel. Most interesting. And I think, by the way, in case you're wondering, that's the point of the author telling us this. Okay, you're wondering, where is this coming from out of the blue? the story of this, how does that fit in? Well, that's how it fits in. It's showing that the priorities of the people, including the people, closest here, are changing and starting to change. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 4. Closing comments.
Eli here in verse 13, he knew exactly what they were doing was wrong. Now I'm reading between the lines here. When Eli was waiting because of what they took the ark, because his heart feared for the ark of God. He knew what they were doing was wrong. That's why I think I knew. That's why he's afraid of what would happen, because if he knew that was right, there's no doubt that God's going to do something. But he knew he was wrong, so he was just waiting for that. And you're right. I think I like what you said about this chapter. Really emphasized that the glory of the Lord has departed from Israel. All this stuff is all negative, and the ark is just, let's say, a representation of God in Israel.
I think this is a great example of when God says he's going to do something, he does it. And, Eli knew this was going to come eventually, but I think it's really interesting that he and his sons died on the same day. We don't know how long it took for the news to get to his daughter-in-law, but I mean, the family is beginning to pay exactly the way the Lord said that they would.
Yeah, because he said the whole family is going to be wiped out, including that son that's mentioned here, is going to get wiped out. So that concludes chapter 4. Thank you very much for joining us here, and we'll see you next week for chapter 5.